Very warm welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Alexander Stroh-Steckelberg. I'm a political scientist, and you might be surprised why you see me here. I mean, at least those who have participated in the workshop organized by the Chair of African Legal Studies. I'm very happy that we can share this event, this session, with the so-called Kolloquium of the Sociology Department. So warm welcome to my colleagues from the department. Thoko, Kaime, and I will organize a series of lectures this semester in the framework of the so-called Sociology Colloquium, and we kind of hijacked this session as a first special event for the Colloquium. That's the framework in which I'm here for the moment, looking very much forward to the talk, and thanks for joining us today in this special event, and that's where I would like to hand over to Thoko for a proper introduction of the talk. Just one note before we miss out on it in the ending and everybody is already disappearing. We just, due to organizational matters, you have those of you who have seen the posters with the program of the entire lecture series. Due to organizational matters and the fact there's a lot of events next Wednesday, we decided to move the next session of the colloquium by 1 week to the 23rd of May. So next session will not be on the 14th, not immediately next week, but on the 23rd, for those of you who are based in Bayreuth and would like to join us. This is not only for the sociology department, but it's open to everybody who's interested in the lecture series, definitely. So yeah, those of you who are here, take a look at the poster. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexander. And welcome to all of you that are just joining us. So for the last 3 days, we've been looking at various aspects of law and belonging, and we are really pleased, Alexander and I, to incorporate this into these discussions about the place of law in enabling or refusing belonging. And in introducing Tshepo, I have a lot to say, but it won't me to say two words, as you can hear. Tshepo Madlingozi is Professor of Human Rights and Constitutionalism, and currently is serving as a commissioner of the South African Commission on Human Rights. And his life work is a radical critique of the South African Constitution and the transformation of South Africa's legal and political order. And he will share some of these perspectives in this talk. And his discussant is my dear friend Joschka Phillips, who is a junior research group leader here at Bayreuth, and his focus is on the politics of the unknown, and there will be a conversation about social movement struggles for decolonization and reconstitution from below. So, Tshepo, welcome to Bayreuth, and I look forward to listening to you and discussing many of the ideas that you'd like to share with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Thoko. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to Alex and to Thoko for organizing this. It's so good to see all of you here. I don't know why Thoko says welcome, because I've only spoken yesterday, and I'll speak again on Friday. You will hear that, in a sense, the ideas build on one another. But what I want to do today is to do two things. Number one, to decenter the law. to decenter the constitution and focus more on social movement struggles. So the talk will be more along the lines of political sociology. I trained both as a lawyer and as a sociologist, so you'll see that there's not much law in this paper, but we can talk about law if you want. On Friday, we'll also talk more about decolonization. The second thing that I want to do is to engage some of the themes that we've been grappling with over the last 3 days. The notion of belonging and belongingness, the role of law in either fostering belonging or actually fostering the otherization of people, but also the subtext in most of our discussion, and that subtext is decolonization, the role of decolonial theory and decoloniality in some of the themes that we are talking about, from a law perspective, from a sociology perspective, from a politics perspective. Is decoloniality the way to go? And I want to look at this from the perspective of social movements. What is the role of social movements in fostering belonging from below? Most projects of belongingness are top-down projects. Most projects of belongingness are top-down projects from the state, from international organization, even from NGOs. I see NGOs as also part of this professional network that imposes belonging from below. So when I talk about social movements, we should make a distinction between social movements and NGOs. The social movement that I'm going to be talking about is Abahlali Basem John Dollar, the Sheikh Dollars movement of South Africa. That is a movement that I'm going to be proposing as a case study, not a perfect case study, but a case study nonetheless. This year, this movement is celebrating 20 years of existence. It was formed in 2005. So this year is their 20th anniversary. Over the past 20 years, 24 of their leaders and members have been assassinated. 24 of their leaders and members have been assassinated in the South Africa of Mandela, the South Africa of the transformative constitutionalism, the South Africa of the Rainbow Nation. 24 members of this organization have been assassinated. Why is political elites intent on the destruction of this organization? What is it about this organization that has led to the unleashing of this wave of attacks against this movement? We will see why. It's because this movement seeks to reconstitute South Africa from below. You can call it a project of decolonization on the one hand and reconstitution on the other hand. Deconstitution and reconstitution at the same time. This is unlike most social movements and other poor people's movements in South Africa. Most poor people's movement in South Africa, the rest of Africa, are interested in struggles that we can call struggles for belonging, meaning struggles that are based on two things. One, struggles based on recognition. Please recognize us. We are the poor of the poorest. Please recognize us. We are sexual minorities. Please recognize us because we are indigenous people, we are black people. There are struggles for recognition. And the second pillar, of course, are struggles for integration. Recognize us and therefore integrate us into the polity. From a deep colonial perspective, struggles for recognition and integration are always struggles for assimilation. And therefore, there are always struggles for the entrenchment of the world of the oppressor. struggles for recognition, and struggles for integration are always struggles ultimately that leads to the entrenchment of the world of the oppressor. Abahleli basemjondolo tries to move away from that. So for better and for worse, the decolonial term has become so popular. Everything is decolonial these days. Decolonial this, decolonial that. But we never, number one, never hear who is supposed to be doing this decolonization. Of course, people talk about the university and so forth, but in society, who are the movements today that are engaged with decolonization? But number two, we never hear about everyday struggles for decolonization, what I call everyday struggles for decolonization, not the big struggles waged by political parties or waged by militant groups during struggles of reconstituting society. But what are the everyday struggles for decolonization? So this movement, this talk wants to look at one such an example of an everyday struggle for decolonization. But more specifically, I focus on the historical settler colonial context. That's my only context that I'm focusing on, is settler colonial context. And I want to argue and show that in the context of settler colonization, social movement struggles are not solely the struggles for recognition and distribution. You will remember the famous paper by Nancy Fraser, Recognition and Distribution. That social movement struggles are, or social justice struggles are either struggles for distribution, so give us goods, give us water, give us electricity, give us healthcare, give us housing. Or there are social justice struggles for recognition. Please recognize us because we are the minorities. That is the normal social justice framework. I want to argue that in the context of historically settler colonial states, we should understand some struggles of social movement as struggles for pariahdom, struggles against pariahdom. And I've got two epigraphs at the beginning of this paper. One epigraph comes from 1916, written by Solomon Tsekisho Blackie, 1916, in a book called Native Life in South Africa. Native Life in South. This is during the height of colonialism in South Africa, 1916. And he writes this book to analyze the impact of the Native Land Act. The Native Land Act was an act that dispossessed Black South Africans, to say Black South Africans can only own 13% of the land, 1/13. So this is an act that came to being in 1913 to consolidate land dispossession. And this is how we understand, this is the first line in that book, the first line in that book. Awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913, the South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of their death, of their birth. I almost say death. Name is death. Social death. So what does it mean to have a condition that is worse than being a slave? Not actually a slave, but a pariah. He says that's the worst that has happened to us. The outcast in the land of your birth. The premise of this talk is that the condition of native pariahdom continues in South Africa today. The condition of native pariahdom continues in South Africa today. And pariahdom, I will argue that ultimately leads to a condition of worldlessness. To be without a world. We should not understand it as simply leading to a condition of marginalization. These people are marginalized. No. We should not even understand it as a struggle for or a condition of exclusion. From a African phenomenological perspective, this condition leads to a condition of worldlessness, to be without the world. What is pariahdom? Pariahdom is a constitutive and foundational settler colonial conditions that confines indigenous people and other people into lived experiences of one, homelessness because of land dispossession, two, unhomeliness, three, a condition of rootlessness, to have without roots, not to have roots, because of dislocation and constant displacement. And then four, a condition of namelessness. You just become a native, or a Kefa, or a nigger, or a Bantu. A nameless condition. But ultimately, pariahdom leads to this condition of wordlessness. To be wordless in a settler-created state is to become a perpetual pariah. Now, a perpetual pariah has got three options open to them in a new settler-created house. By the way, there's a reason why we call it the New World, right? It's a world that is created by the settlers. The creation of the New World leads to a de-worlding for other people, worldlessness. There are three conditions open to an indigenous person in this new world. One, to accept settler futurity, the future well-being of settlers, and to accept the settler's house, and to engage in struggles for integration and assimilation. That's the first option. To accept this, that the settler house will always be here. My fight should be for integration and assimilation. The second option open to a perpetual pariah is to accept a position of liminality, to say, I won't belong to the settler house, I will stay in its shadows and engage in struggle of fugitivity, coming in, stealing, and coming back, coming out. Struggles for fugitivity. You remember that in Latin America and elsewhere in the Caribbean, we had maroon societies. Remember the maroon societies? Those societies that escaped enslavement and created their own little autonomous societies. The last option, of course, is to forge organization that will fight for the destruction of the settler's house. Not to integrate, not to forge fugitivity, but to say we don't accept the settler's house and we are going to destroy the settler's house. I don't know if you have seen the movie Django. Have you seen the movie Django? The last scene of Django kills all the masters, but doesn't take over the house. He burns down the house. Right? That's the scene in Django. However, can we contemplate non-armed collectives of pariahs that do not fit into this typology that I've proposed? So that's what I'm going to propose here. And I'm going to propose that we should understand, therefore, in this context, decolonization as a process of world making. Decolonization as a process of world making. That's how we should understand decolonization. So let me start with section 1. So as I said, Abahlali was created in 2005, created as a movement fighting for housing, land, and dignity. That was the initial impulse of creating this movement of shack dwellers, to fight for housing, to fight for land, and to fight what they called dignity. On 26 September 2009, heavily armed men attacked a meeting of Abahlali Basemjondolo. After this attack, 1,000 people were displaced. Shacks belonging to Abahlali organizers were burned down, and the attackers had occupied Abahlali headquarters. It is alleged that this attack took place under police watch and police complicity. But most importantly, it was alleged that this attack was done by members of the African National Congress, the ruling party, the local branch of the ruling party that attacked this movement. The president of Abahlali spent several years underground. By the way, I met him in 2010, living underground. Even today, 2025, he's still living in safe houses because he can't return to his home. The attack on Abahlali marked a significant departure from the way the ruling party engaged with social movements. Before then, the ruling party engaged with social movements in three ways. One, by delegitimization, just delegitimizing them. These people are violent, society must ignore them. Secondly, by co-optation, co-opting their leaders, co-opting some of the social movements. Or three, via jailing some of the leaders, taking some of the leaders to jail. This was the first time that the state, through its local agents, allegedly sought to destroy an entire movement, an entire autonomous community. Now, I call it an autonomous community because what Abahlali has been engaged in is the occupation of land, and then from those occupations, creating new communities. So that has been their modus operandi. They occupy land and they create autonomous communities. So this was the first time that the ruling party tried to destroy the entire movement. What is it about this movement that the state was so much intent on destroying? Allegedly, I mean, I should say allegedly always, because I'm a lawyer. I open with this tale because it shows the conflicting interpretation and understanding of liberation in South Africa or post-colonial South Africa. But at a more profound level, it neatly captures the premise of this paper. The premise of this paper is that historically conquered and enslaved and structurally oppressed peoples striving for liberation. Sorry, the premise of this paper is that historically conquered, enslaved, and other oppressed people are engaged in strivings for constitution and belonging. By constitution, as I said yesterday, I don't mean a legal instrument. I go back to the etymology of constitution, which is constant, to live together or to stand together, but also the decolonial imperative to constitute a properly post-apartheid society, post-segregationist society, a society of universal belongingness. Now, what is interesting is that for Abahlali, as they put forward their mission statement, their mission is to create, as is in the slide, a struggle for a world where everyone counts. A struggle for a world where everyone counts. Not a struggle just for housing, just for electricity, but a struggle for a world where everyone counts. You remember the book, Ungrievable Lives. Who called that again? Ungrievable Lives. Julie Butler. Yes. And there he has it that other lives are ungrievable because they do not count. They are ungrievable lives because they do not count. Judith Butler. So their struggle is for a struggle for a world where everyone counts. We'll see how they do that. So I propose that while the most common and immediate demands of such movements is for civil and political rights, is for distribution of socio-economic goods, is for recognition, is to participate in democracy. But at the more profound level, the struggles should be understood as a struggle against pariahdom, Dom, of course, as I said earlier, is an inherent settler colonial condition. There's a difference between colonialism and settler colonialism. The difference being that, of course, for settler colonialism, the settler leaves home with the intention of creating a home elsewhere. And in these processes of homemaking, and dehoming, it leads to the fundamental dehoming of those whose homes were there before. In these uneven processes of very violent dehoming and homemaking, settler invaders seek to displace, delegitimize, and suppress indigenous perception of the world, ways of knowing, and relationship to the environment. Because the first thing that the settler needs to do is to engage in coloniality of knowledge before they exercise coloniality of power and coloniality of being. Coloniality of knowledge is the first weapon of the colonizer. I think, therefore I am. They don't think, therefore they are not. That is the first thing. So if you look at the diaries of colonizers in South Africa, that's that they said, these things or these people don't have a language. They said, they don't have a language. They don't have a God. You know, can't see their churches, whatever. They don't have a God. And they don't have a knowledge system. So coloniality of knowledge becomes a condition of possibility for coloniality of being. Who is a rational animal? Who is not a rational animal? Those who are not a rational animal are non-beings, therefore their land are what? Terra nullis. Terra nullis. The fundamental understanding of terra nullis is what? Nobody's land. Nobody's land. Not that there is nobody here. There are things here, but there are nobodies. They're almost like flora, fauna, and animals. Nobody's land, because they're not human beings. Coloniality of knowledge leads to coloniality of being, leads to coloniality of power. From there, that legitimizes land dispossession, enslavement, economic subjugation. So, at a more profound level, I want to propose that if we are serious about struggles for belonging and reconstitution, such struggles should be engaged in, first of all, engage in struggles against coloniality of knowledge, against coloniality of being, and against coloniality of power. Coloniality of being, who's human and who's not human. The struggles for recognition say that I want you to recognize me because you are more human than I am. Please, white people, recognize me. Please, the global north, please recognize me. Men, please recognize me. There is a hierarchical existence, and struggles for recognition always reconfirms that kind of hierarchy. I was listening carefully to Professor Farida yesterday about how do we reconstitute the world, and whether it is via struggles for recognition of the global north, or whether we do it in a different way. In the case of South Africa, as I said, settler colonization, we should understand it fundamentally as leading to 5 outcomes: unhomeliness, homelessness, rootlessness, material impoverishment, and ultimately worldlessness. This is why when you go to South Africa, there's a popular struggle song, My Buye Africa. My Buye Africa. My Buye Africa fundamentally meaning return Africa, resurrect Africa, remember Africa. That's what it fundamentally means. My Buye Africa. And this response was a response to the thesis. The thesis is that settler colonization led to ilizwe lifile. You hear this in the 19th century in South Africa, as more Western modernity erupts into the lives of indigenous people, as more African kingdoms are conquered, as more displacement and dislocation takes place. You hear people say ilizwe lifile from the 19th century. Chinua Achebe's got a famous book, Things Fall Apart. What are these things that are fall apart? It is indeed the world. It is indeed the world that falls apart. The thesis is the world is dead. The synthesis is, or the answer is, Maibuye in Africa. Constitutional rearrangements in South Africa and elsewhere did not answer this question of Maibuye in Africa correctly. And therefore, those constitutional rearrangements have continued what we call relative paradigm. Ilizwe lifile, this cry sought to convey the sense that conquest, colonization, land dispossession, displacement actually led to death of the world, or what we can call worldlessness. The outcome of death of the world and institutional, as well as institutional processes that guarantee settler indigenization. Remember, settlers have to indigenize themselves. That's why they have to say Afrikaner from Africa, right? Afrikaner. This institutionalization of settler indigenization led to perpetual paradigm. That's why I started this talk with that line from Solomon Blackie, awakening on this day, not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of thy death. Ultimately, and to borrow an official designation from colonial South Africa, settlers transformed indigenous people into foreign natives. They disinherited, they denationalized, they invisibilized others of the settler created polity. So that was the official designation of Black people in colonial South Africa, the foreign natives. The foreign natives. That was the designation officially of Black people. The Bantus are the foreign natives in their own hand. And of course, constitutional law, whether written or unwritten, is a fundamental apparatus of these processes of indigenizing the settler and naturalizing the fact of conquest. Constitutional law, whether it's written or unwritten, is a fundamental constitutive apparatus in this social-political project of indigenizing the settler and naturalizing the fact of conquest. How is colonization naturalized? Well, we can think about something called South Africa. South Africa created in 1910. Created in 1910 by settlers. 1910 South Africa. It has become a natural phenomenon. It has been accepted as a natural phenomenon, South Africa. But South Africa is a creation of settlers. The mistake that the dominant wing of the liberation movement made was to fight for the new South Africa. The new South Africa. Struggles that accept the settler house, whether you call it a new house or a new South Africa, ultimately perpetuate settler colonization. I'm not talking about settler colonialism, I'm talking about settler colonization. What is the difference between colonialism and colonization? You can defeat colonialism, but have you actually defeated colonization? If we accept that, therefore, a post-conquest and a decolonizing constitutional rearrangement should be the one that seek to deconstitute the settler-created world. A post-conquest and a decolonizing constitution must seek to deconstitute the settler-created world. In the case of South Africa, you will know that in 1994, South Africa became liberated in 1994. But what happened in 1994 is that a transformative paradigm won over a decolonial paradigm. A transformative paradigm won over a decolonial paradigm. That's why we can talk about a transformative constitution, not a decolonial constitution. So in 1994, the democratization of South Africa was based on a paradigm of transformation and on a paradigm of decolonization. How do we understand the difference between the two? The difference that leads to a society that is democratized but not decolonized. Democratized but not decolonized. How do we understand that paradox? So one philosopher, Mogobe Ramosas, says that the current constitution of South Africa has resulted in, I quote, conquest by consent. The new constitution of South Africa, he says, has led to conquest by consent. I won't go into details about that because I mentioned that yesterday, the fact that at the heart of South Africa's constitution is a paradox of constitutionalism without constitution. A paradox of constitutionalism without constitution. The failure to constitute a properly post-colonial society where everyone feels a sense of material and affective belongingness. Material and affective belongingness. Conquest by consent. And as I said, I won't go into details, but you know that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. You know that South Africa has got GBV levels that are higher than in war zones. Gender-based violence in South Africa is higher than in most war zones in the world. You know that in South Africa, white people who are 8% own 70% of the land. 8% owns 70% of the land. And you also know that this year is the 10-year anniversary of Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall. This year is the 10-year anniversary. So in 2015, university students erupted in uprisings that they called Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall. And at the heart of those uprisings were not just about university access, fees must fall. It was not only about changing status and the aesthetics of the university. Fundamentally, it was about a plea to decolonize South Africa. 2015, the youth talking about the need to decolonize South Africa. It came as a shock to all of us, even those of us who have been working in this area, that young people will in 2015 erupt in struggles of decolonization. Why would it be necessary to talk about decolonization in 2015? It is because the constitutional rearrangements in South Africa have not led to decolonization in the terms that I have been talking about. And it's interesting because these young people are so-called the born-free generation, meaning that they are born after 1994, the born-free generation. But born-free also in the sense that they are free from oppression, free from apartheid. Well, they said, we don't feel free. We don't feel that we are the born-free. That was in 2015. The last section, Abahlali Basemjondolo. So as I said, this organization fight for umhlaba, izindlu, and isithunzi. Umhlaba is land, izindlu is homes or houses, and isithunzi is dignity. Dignity. But dignity, I mean, you can't translate some of these terms. People translate it to dignity, but it's more like a shadow. You know, dignity in our language is almost like a shadow. Let me not complicate it, but let's say dignity. Let's say dignity for now. And every year on the 27th of April, South Africa celebrates Freedom Day, the 27th of April. South Africa celebrates Freedom Day. But Abahlali, every year on the 27th, they say we mourn on Freedom Day. They call it Unfreedom Day. Every year they mourn unfreedom. And this is what their leader said in 2004, 10 years of democracy. 20 years after apartheid, we live like pigs in the mud. Our children die of diarrhea. We are forced into transit camps at gunpoint. The police beat us and shoot us in the streets, and the assassins kill us with impunity. If we stand up and demand that our humanity be recognized, we are removed from the housing list and put on the death list. If we demand to be treated as human beings, this is when actually we get killed. So Abahlali has distinguished itself from other movements by declaring that while their short to medium term demands are for belonging, but their long-term demands are, quote unquote, a world where everyone counts. So at its boldest, my thesis is that Abahlali is engaged in a struggle for Malibuye Africa, return Africa, resurrect Africa, remember Africa, remember the words that were shattered by settler colonization. Because as I said, settler colonization leads to the shattering of the social, cultural worlds of indigenous people. To understand Abahlali's radical vision, it is necessary to contrast it with, to construct that vision of constitutional belonging with those of most impoverished organizations. Two important elements distinguish Abahlali. Their vision is distinguished by two things. One, most organization accepts the discourse of post-apartheid. That is the starting point of most social movements and the NGO sector, is an acceptance of the discourse of post-apartheid. Abahlali rejects that discourse. Abahlali says, we are not in post-apartheid. But secondly, whilst most movements struggles for liberal belongingness, give us water, give us electricity, please recognize us, please integrate us into society. Abahlali, as I said, demand a completely new world. Not a struggle for integration into the world, but a struggle for a new world, as I said. And it's important that Abahlali rejects the discourse of post-apartheid. You know, South Africa is built on a linear temporality. As you know, in Western modernity, time is linear, right? In Western modernity, time is from A to B, from 1 to 2 is linear. But in African cosmology, time is cyclical, right? Abahlali rejects the idea that you've got post-apartheid, you've got the new South Africa, you've got transitional justice. South Africa is built on these discourses: the Rainbow Nation, post-apartheid, transitional justice, and ultimately new South Africa. Abahlali fundamentally reject that discourse. How much time do you have? 5 minutes, okay, I thought so. Okay, let me jump quickly. Abahlali fundamentally teaches us that to engage in proper struggles of belonging, one must engage in free moves, free movements. The first movement is refusal to demand recognition. Let me term it differently. The first move is to refuse that which has been refused to you. The first move is to refuse that which has been refused to you. If recognition was refused to you, the demand or the first move is not to claim recognition, but actually the first move is to reclaim humanity for yourself. I am a human being. That will involve the decolonization of the mind and the overcoming of double consciousness. The first struggle is the struggle of reclaiming humanity for yourself through decolonization of the mind, overcoming double consciousness, and reclaiming humanity for themselves. I am a human being. Not to say, please recognize me, I'm a human being. That's the first move. The second move is to forge a strong group consciousness. The second move is to foster a strong group consciousness. And that is possible when you appropriate the identity that was an identity of shame and of inferiority, whether it's black, which is a term of inferiority. Part of forging a strong group consciousness is to say, yes, we are black. Yes, we are queer. Yes, we are Bantu. And using that group consciousness to fight against structural racism, structural sexism, structural patriarchy. So the first move is decolonization of the mind. The second move is forging a group identity. But the second one only takes place if there has been an epistemological break. The second move is made possible by an epistemological break. As I said, the first move of the colonizer is coloniality of knowledge. And therefore they tell you lies about you. And double consciousness comes from this acceptance of these lies. So group consciousness and the reclamation of own humanity are not possible unless there's been epistemic disobedience, epistemological break. Now, as I said, I don't have much time, but you see this in Abahlali. Listen to the name that they gave themselves, the shack dwellers of South Africa. They didn't say we are the anti-privatization movement or the housing organization. We are the shack dwellers, an identity that is associated with shame and illegality. They say we will call ourselves that kind of dignity. But Abahlali also engaged in epistemological disobedience or epistemic disobedience. As I said, you see it by their discourse, their rejection of hegemonic discourses of the new South Africa, of post-apartheid, and so forth. But they also do that by forging their own spaces of thinking. So they've got a University of Abahlali Basemjondolo from 2008. They've set up something called the University of Abahlali Basemjondolo, where they engage in their own theorization of their own struggle. They've got a famous, one of them is going to said this the other day. We are professors of our own suffering, quote unquote. We are professors of our own suffering. By doing so, they're not only rejecting the discourse of the poor, they're also rejecting the tutelage of NGOs. So Abahlali rejects the involvement of NGOs in their struggles, because they're very clear that NGOs are engaged in, no, I know there are NGO people here. Let me leave it there, but they reject the NGOization of politics, by middle class, professional, iPhone wielding, middle class people. They reject that kind of thing. And as I said, at the heart of Abahlali is their injustice frame, how they frame injustice. So for them, injustice is not just give us housing and then we'll be quiet. So you can't buy them off just by giving them housing and land. This is how one of their leaders put it. Freedom for us is a way of living, not a list of demands to be made. Delivering a house will do away with lack of houses, but it won't make us free on its own. Freedom for us is a way of living where everyone is important, where everyone's experience and intelligence counts. We've often said that we are free, we are not free because even many people who say they are for the struggles of the poor refuse to think, to believe that we can think. What they're talking about, NGOs. NGOs engage with poor people as if poor people cannot think. So they say, for us, freedom is our ability to think for ourselves. Hence, the idea of Abahlali, University of Abahlali. The professors of our own suffering. Let me go to the last one, quickly, the last section, which is the deconstitution of the world by Abahlali. So I have said that there are 4 outcomes of settler colonization. 1, unhomeliness. 2, homelessness. 3, rootlessness. And then 4, namelessness. How does Abahlali try to attend to all of this? Number 1, namelessness. As I said, Abahlali, by appropriating a name associated with shame and illegality, they are putting a name to themselves, by themselves, and for themselves. 2, the condition of unhomeliness. As I said earlier, everywhere where Abahlali occupies land, they are engaged in building autonomous communities where there are food gardens, where there are football teams, where there are choir teams, where there are daycare centers for kids, and where there are community safety forums. So really an attempt to build communities based on African humaneness through food gardens, through football teams, choir teams, daycare centers, and food gardens and so forth. But thirdly, Abahlali has forged very strong and very loyal transnational alliances. They forged very, very strong transnational alliances because they understand that you cannot defeat the global matrix of coloniality in one area, but that the fight must be a global fight. So they forged alliances with people in Brazil, in Zabastisa, in Mexico, other organizations in Kenya and Africa, and so forth. A strong transnational alliance that they have forged. So we can understand that they are engaged in what can be called decolonial cosmopolitanism. Not the liberal cosmopolitan, but the decolonial cosmopolitanism. This is how the leader describes this condition or this ideal. Poor people themselves must care and must come up with a new living, an autonomous life, a completely independent stance where a new world order will be about alternative ways of being in the world. The idea that the new world will be created by the damned of the earth themselves. the new world order will be created by the damned of the world themselves through this kind of alliances, leading to insurgent cosmopolitanism, leading to decolonial cosmopolitanism. I know my time is up. Let me end with this poem by MECC. We have to start. Start what? The only thing in the world was starting. The end of the world for human sake. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this passionate talk and for all of the information. I've written way too much than I can summarize. What I will do, or what I would like to do, is basically to what I've sort of found is the main points. Then I have a few questions of understanding, and then we can open up the floor. So first of all, thank you for, I think, making the point that the importance of sociology. So your sociology hat vis-a-vis the legal scholar hat, showing that oftentimes this idea of the rainbow nation that's based on a legal system finds itself confronted with social realities that are much different. And then the question of how social movements basically try to run against this. And I think what my main question, but you sort of answered it in the end, was that transition from pariahdom to decolonization and world making. Even though I was wondering to what degree that process, sort of historically, how it built up, or whether there were setbacks also with regards to other countries. You said you met with the organization quite early on in 2010. And I imagine that sort of speaking to that history is on the one hand, it's to show that it is possible, that decolonization is possible. But I'm quite certain that there are also, I mean, these people run against a system, and this struggle is full of difficulties. So perhaps if you can see what lies between pariahdom and decolonization in that specific process, I would be very interested in that. The other thing that I found very interesting was your concept of constitution. So a constitution that is basically a question of sociability, yes, right? So Abathali developing a constitution that's built on a kind of belonging, on a kind of social life that goes beyond the legal idea of the term. And at the same time, again, what I was wondering, you were talking about the question of names and namelessness. Abathali, what does that mean? What does the term mean? I was also wondering whether the shack dwellers, the sort of international network, the cosmopolitan network that they are part of, is that shack dwellers international? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about that, because I found that to be very interesting in ways in which, this movement is really a connection across the globe, and how, whether, we often talk about the transnational connections nowadays due to the internet, social media, and so on. But I do think that these connections are even more difficult for organizations of the poor to connect in the same way that the rich people do. And to see how class plays into the opportunities, but also the difficulties of connecting through social media, through the digital realm. And I think in a way what I really appreciated also was this the general thrust of your talk, contrasting what Patel Chatterjee with regard to Franz Fanon calls the political society versus civil society, and the NGOization, the difficulty of actually finding agency outside of that realm of reformists. So I think this idea that for anything to change, everything must change. I think this is sort of the the main idea that you've also put forth. But then again, so I think what I'm wondering also with regards to your position in all of this, I found fascinating how you talked about it, and at the same time you are part also of an institution that's in a very interesting position between bottom up and top down. So when you say that most institutions of belonging are built from the top down side, whether that contrast in your particular life world, I think you're mediating also between these different worlds, whether the directionality is always so easy to fathom, whether we can think of institutions as being both top down and bottom up, and ultimately what comes out of them, it depends on how the people position themselves with regards to one another. I think these would be the key questions that I have. And then I'll be very happy to take any kinds of question from the room. I don't know whether you want to first respond or whether.
No, thank you for that. You took a lot, even though I did not send you the paper before that. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. You asked what is the in-between sort of neo-apartheid and decolonization? What is the in-between? Well, they call it a state of unfreedom. Now, of course, unfreedom is grammatically incorrect, but it's interesting that they use a grammatically incorrect term. I see that as part of this epistemic disobedience. But that is the in-between, a state of unfreedom. No longer, you can't argue that South Africa is under colonialism and apartheid. That would be unfair. South Africa is not under colonialism and apartheid, but also not a free society. So the in-between is this liminal space of unfreedom as a point. And that takes me to your question about setbacks. There has been a lot of setbacks. I mean, the organization is about 30 to 35,000 members, 30 to 35,000 members in different provinces. But there's been a lot of setbacks. As I said, the first one is the fact that 24 of their leaders have been killed. That's a huge setback. And that has led to a lot of people being scared to associate with them. The second setback is that, as I said, I met the leader in 2010 and I had an interview for the book that I was editing. But even today, he's still living in safe houses, underground. We don't know where he lives exactly. He's not free. He's not free. The other setbacks, of course, is this question that you were saying, the reform versus maybe revolution. Other people, other members of the organization say, no, we need houses now. Don't talk about world making and, those fancy things. I need a house now. I need a clinic now. I need water now. And if you give me that, I'll be happy. So they struggle to balance that. How do you balance immediate demands and immediate needs with this revolutionary long-term goal? Has led to tensions in the movement, has led to tensions. But also, as I said, the movement was formed in 2005. Their occupation, most times they occupy for 5 years, 6 years, and then the state crushes them. So I don't want to create an idea that they've been successful at holding on to their occupations. There's been serious setback, evictions. And of course, when there's eviction, then Abashiri then uses the law tactically. And they've won all the cases against the state in court because the state always engages in illegal eviction. So they've been able to use the law, even this law that they reject, they've been able to use it tactically. Not as a strategy, but as a tactic. And they've benefited from NGOs representing them. So rejecting NGOs, but working with some NGOs that understand their struggle. And academics that also understand their struggles. But as I said, yeah, it has not been, they give us a path, but they are not there yet. They are not there yet themselves. What does abahlali mean? Abahlali basel Njondolo. Njondolo means shacks. Abahlali means those who live there. Those who live there. Now, if you think about the fundamental position of Black people in South Africa, it's a condition of constant displacement. You know, if I tell you about my family, we've been displaced and moved via generations. You know, there's no Black South African who can tell you this is my home because they recently moved there, you know, because of constant displacement and dislocation. Now they are named Abahlali, those who live here. You can understand that as a radical affirmation of belonging, those who live here. So Abahlali means those who live here, Njondolo means shacks, that's what it means. And then, yeah, in terms of class, Abahlali has been successful in building alliances with radical academics. So every time you go to Abahlali, there's a student from Oxford, from Germany, from Harvard, whatever, coming to do interviews. But they also use those students to spread their messages, to work with them, on their website, on their Twitter page, and whatever, So just like there's a Batista movement in Mexico, how do you use middle class people? How do you co-opt middle class people? Not middle class people co-opting you. They've tried to, so their presence digitally is well covered, they're well represented digitally, and they've been able, especially when the movement is under heavy attack, they've been able to have their alliances or their partners overseas to stage protests at South African embassies, in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in London and so forth. Their partners staging protests. So this global visibility has acted as a protection mechanisms, for them. And then I'll come to my positionality later. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So should we take several questions at once? Yeah. Please.
Yeah, I just found your talk very interesting, especially considering that if you was to put the chronology to what has been happening, the naturalization of colonialism, it starts with a formal law. So, like the 1913 Native Land Act. I mean, what I've definitely read, my quest is to look beyond the text and identify the normative interest in it are quite important and can have very fundamental consequences. And I was just wondering whether in your thinking you see that the danger that the dominant powers see in this organization is the fact that the challenging naturalize the truth. I just having a thought about that. What's really dangerous about them is that their belonging is based on disturbing naturalize the truth, which all institutions, the transformative constitution, and every other institution supports.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is my chance to come back to the questions that you raised previously.
That I raised.
To the panel, and you have given me a wonderful leeway to kind of articulate those questions. So the first question I have is about, thank you very much for a beautiful presentation. So let me start there. The first question I have is about social movements. You frame social movements as we know them traditionally through phrases of recognition and distribution, and you situate this social movement that you're analyzing as a rather radical alternative to that, right? And then you kind of give us an idea of what it is that they say, right, in terms of the propositions. So one of the things they say is like counting.
Yes.
Everyone counts, right? And then so I'm struggling with the idea of counting. Who does the counting? To who do they count? To who do they assert the humanity? Because what I'm struggling with is then if they are to count and if they want to assert their humanity, there is some other group that they are asserting themselves to. There seems to be an implicit assumption there. And then I'm like, okay, how is this then significantly different from the question of recognition and distribution in thinking about social movements? That's one question I have. And the second question brings me to the question you raised about the fact of, that's a question you raised to give, the fact of this, romantic idea of pre-colonial Africa as having had it all well and people fared well back then, but now colonial rules came and all of that thing disappeared and we need to reclaim it, right? And then that you say is pre-colonial or indigenous knowledge is not profoundly progressive, right? And so I agree there. But one of the things this movement says is also like returning Africa. And your intervention is decolonization as remembering, where remembering means assembling in the loopy sense, but also remembering as memory, right? What is there to be remembered? What do we remember when, and if we say whatever has been is not profoundly progressive, how do we do that, right? We need to remember, but how do we select what to remember or what is useful? Like a usable history kind of approach, right? So that's the other question I have. What do they have to say about the nation state, that violent history of the nation state, out of which, well, within which we want to integrate ourselves and about which we have a strong critique due to its violent history? What do they have to say? Do they have an alternative to the nation state? No. And lastly, then I mean, I'm like, okay, this is an opportunity. We don't get to have these conversations all the time with people who are actively involved in the work, but also do the thinking. So that's why I'm like, so the other question is like like this dilemma of, there's the aspiration to bring about the radical change, right? Through that revolutionary aspiration that we have for total emancipation. But there's also the struggle for housing, which are both valid, right? And so how do we strike a balance? I mean, these are not mutually exclusive social struggles within social movements. So we need to fight for housing, decent living, recognition, or whatever, in the immediacies of the everyday struggle. But we also need that radical shift where Joschka says everything has to change, right? How do we balance that? Sort of, if you could share like an experience-based kind of nudge news. Thank you.
So, Sarah, we took 4 questions, but there's Tom, you can. We have 3 people, and then I think you have a lot of answering to do. Tom, please.
So to add one more. Well, I guess I'm interested in the way the ideas and concepts that you mentioned function as resources in the struggle, and maybe also what the limits of that is, because you mentioned the circular understanding of the kind in the African context that you referred to, and if I couple that in my mind with the idea of decolonization, I think I would arrive at the goal of reinstituting the state prior to the colonization, right? So that would be a simple quote unquote negation of the injustice that has been done, and to replace it with a priori state, right? On the other hand, I think that many of the examples that you showed is that the struggle for decolonization that the organization pursues is kind of dependent upon the situation that they find. So in a way, they are somewhat limited in recreating and retrace the displacement and so on and so forth. So in my mind, isn't there some sort of a hidden or concealed dialectics in that process where instead of merely being a simple act of negation or a negation of a negation, right, to undo the colonialism, it's actually a form of dialectics. And the struggle may be even more successful ideologically, maybe, if that also was reflected, but maybe it is reflected.
Thank you. And Alexander.
I just want to add one element to the questions of the second. I think it was the second question of Sarah. Maybe it was the third. And a funny one for a lawyer to ask a lawyer, I think, what's the place of the law in this struggle? And not the one you mentioned as a tactical element, but in the long run. Is there a place for law as we know it?
Yeah, those were fantastic questions, as we say. I don't have all the answers. I appreciate your comment about the unearthing the normative interest. I really appreciate that. But you're quite right, as I said, the reason why middle class people in the state are so opposed to them is because they are unmasking the myth of South Africa. South Africa is built on a fundamental myth that is globally celebrated. You know, our Truth and Reconciliation Commission is celebrated. People say, how can we copy it? And it's been copied in many places. How can we copy the South African Constitution in Zimbabwe, you know, in Kenya, in other contexts, cutting and pasting the South African Constitution. The figure of Mr. Nelson Mandela. And South Africa being able, therefore, to host World Cup, Miss World, because we've moved on. That's why we can host Miss World and, the World Cup and so forth.
Progress.
The progress. So they really puncture that idea of the truth about South Africa. So that's why people want them to go away. So you are quite right. It's really fundamentally Abahlali, and others, not just them, are engaged in exploding and imploding these natural truths. First of all, the truth of conquest. Conquest has been accepted in South Africa. Conquest has been accepted. The only struggle is how do you make it new? How do you assimilate into this thing via the extension of civil rights, the extension of socio-economic rights, and so forth? They are exploding, so you're quite right. That's why they are so much hated. I will answer the other questions by, the model that I like in terms of decolonization is a tritology, the fourness that I see in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work. I return to it over and over again, and when I do, I trace four. I frame a tritology in his work. The first work, of course, is the Decolonization of the Mind book. The second book, which comes out 6 years later, is Moving the Center. The third book came 2009 is Remember Africa. And the last book is Global Lectics. I take his work and I tease out those 4 books as a tautology of what does it mean to remember ourselves. Remembering ourselves, one of the fundamental mistakes that are made by decolonial scholars is to hold on to this idea of delinking. We need to delink from the global system to delink and fashion a black world, fashion an indigenous world. No, the fundamental struggle is how do you remember your world to be part of other worlds? It's a struggle from universalism to pluriversalism. A struggle from universalism to pluriversalism. That is fundamentally the struggle. So it's not a struggle to return to Africa. It's to say, the first thing is to remember yourselves through decolonizing the mind, through overcoming double consciousness. But you don't stay there. You engage dialectically with the world. So in my PhD, I say that the decolonial dream is a Creole world. Creole from colonization, for me, That's the decolonial world, a world that takes all our multiple heritages for better and for worse. We can't wish away Westernization of Africans. It is part of our heritage. We can't wish away Islam and so forth and so forth. But Africa will be at the center as we assimilate all the other things. So the struggle of decolonization is to remember Africa so that you engage with the world with Africa at the center. Okay? That's what we mean by global lactics, engaging in decolonization. So it is not a struggle to go back to pre-colonial. We don't even know. We don't even know what it means. We don't even know. So that's what we do at Yongo. The second one that I will offer is Amilcar Cabral, Return to the Source, a famous speech. It's a speech, it's not a book, a speech by Amilcar Cabral, Return to the Source. And that speech has been misinterpreted a lot. People say return to the source means the source of pre-colonial Africa. No, that's not what he says. He says return to the source of those who are not completely ensnared in Western modernity. Because in every place where there's been Western modernity, there are villages and villagers and other people who are not completely ensnared in Western modernity. Of course, there's Western modernity, but not completely ensnared. And he says, if you go there, you might understand the different ways of being in the world that is Africa center, return to the source. Frantz Fanon, in his last book, makes that plea, by the way, in The Depth of the Earth. You remember his first book, second book, Black Skin, White Mask. It ends with him crying. He cries, right? And after he cries, he said, oh, my body, let me be the man who always think, always questions. And the second book, the last book starts with the phrase, colonialism is violence, decolonization is always violent. But he doesn't stay there. He stays in this idea of global leftists, Frantz Fanon himself, and a critique of African leaders and so forth. So remembering Africa, number one, is not the return to pre-colonial Africa. We don't even know what's pre-colonial Africa, but certainly is the overcoming of double consciousness, internalized patriarchy, internalized homophobia, internalized ableism, internalized racism. But from our perspective, remembering Africa means Africa being at the center, and you engage with the world from that perspective, global ethics, from that perspective. And I talk about Black internationalism. Black internationalism has always been fundamental. If you think of Pan-Africanist congresses of Du Bois and others, if you think of negritudes of Aimé Césaire, Senghor, if you think of the Haiti Revolution, if you think about Black moments of reconstitution, there's always a tension within those movements that is very productive. A tension where you are fighting for independence and sovereignty, but at the same time, a discomfort with the nation state, Pan-Africanism. So the most radical Pan-Africanists were saying to us, you gain independence, but immediately you dissolve the nation state for Pan-Africanism. You gain sovereignty, but you immediately dissolve the nation state for a Pan-African agenda, where there won't be the nation state, but there will be this idea of Pan-Africanism. How exactly? Not clear. But that is the idea that the nation state will always be violent. And of course, it's not to return to the African states. Were there African states before colonialism? It's a huge debate. Were there African states before colonialism? There were African kingdoms, not states, African kingdoms. Those kingdoms were based on very malleable and very porous ethnic identity. They were not Zulu kingdoms. this idea of that there were Zulu kingdoms, there were whatever kingdoms, that's a creation of anthropology and ethnology. In Zimbabwe, Terence Ranger talks about the invention of tradition. Very, very lovely book, Invention of Tradition. So the idea that there were African states based on specific ethnic groups, that's a later creation. But the African kingdoms were based on malleable identity, porous ethnic identity. And if you want to return to anything, you need to return to that. This idea of a porous identity. But the fact that I want to fight to be Zulu, I want to fight to be, that's a colonialist trap. It's a colonialist trap. It's a colonialist trap. So the return, no, not to return to African states, but to return to this idea of malleable and Creole identity. How it will look like, I don't know. But I know that I'm personally attracted to decolonization as creolization on our own terms. Creolization on our own terms, not imposed creolization, as in the Caribbean, for example. Yeah, the role of the law. It's interesting that in 2018, there were xenophobic attacks in South Africa, huge xenophobic attacks, where a lot of people who were foreigners were supposedly killed. 55 people killed. I say supposedly because half of the people killed were South Africans, but they were dark. So people thought they come from somewhere else, but they were killed, for example. Abashali Basam Jodolo is one movement that came out to fight against xenophobia. And they said, my neighbor is my friend. Everyone belongs wherever they find them. So you find this notion within them, a strong anti-xenophobic stance. I claim that it's not just anti-xenophobic, but it is a stance against the nation state. But every time there's xenophobic uprising, Abashali shields the foreigners and non-national that lives amongst Abashali. But yes, the nation state, you remember that when the OAU, Thoko, was created, this notion of oti possidenti, which meant you keep the colonial borders as they are. That was the OAU. The OAU said, we keep the colonial borders as they are. There was a debate. And that led to a lot of civil wars because every time there were minorities in every place who, would fight. But the nation state fundamentally, as a unit of decolonization, it's a huge mistake. It's a huge mistake. We have seen that in Africa. But is Pan-Africanism or Pan-African the way to go? There are also limits there, of course, there are also limits there. Marcus Garvey said we should have Pan-Africanism with me as the president. The guy never visited Africa at all. He never came to Africa. We love Marcus Garvey. He studied where I studied at Bedberg, but yeah, it's very limited. The role of the law, I need to think about that properly. You're quite right, as I said, they use the law tactically now, but they have a notion of long-term post-conquest decolonized law. I'm sure they do, but I'm not clear. I need to think about that. Thank you.
We are unfortunately already time-wise at the end. Could you say one word with regards to the question of the hidden dialectics that Tom was asking about?
Yes, as I said, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book that I like is Globalectic, and it's based on this idea that we engage with the globe dialectically. And it's really about that. Dialectics is at the heart of the struggle. The idea of delinking is a tactic, it's not a strategy. Delinking from Western modernity, from the global system, it's a tactic, it's not a strategy. But you engage dialectically after you've remembered who you are. Western modernity says to Africans, you must engage with the there from the there. Decolonization says you engage with the there from the here. And once they hear, me, as I am. You don't engage with the there from the there, you engage with the there from the here. What does here-ness mean? What does being here mean? So in the 1970s, the Black consciousness movement of Steve Biko, I offer it as a model, the Black consciousness model. So Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s said, number one, we don't recognize the state. So unlike the ANC and other people, they do not want anything to do with their party state. They do not make any demands against the state. We don't recognize the state at all. Number two, they said, we are not going to reclaim our humanity from white South Africans. In fact, we deem white South Africans to have exited the realm of humanness. We are not dehumanized. White people have dehumanized themselves by their brutality, by their land dispossession, and by holding on to, and not sharing. They have dehumanized themselves. We are the humans. And Steve Biko writes about that a lot. Frantz Fanon's book is Black Skin, White Mask. Steve Biko's, one of his chapters is called White Skin, Black Soul. White Skin, Black Soul. And ask whether do white people have a soul. Very fundamental in the debates in the 1500s about whether the indigenous people have a soul. Remember those debates, the papal debates in the international law that Prof was talking about yesterday. And the second thing that they did was that they created their own things. They had their own clinics, they had their own schools, and so forth. So they reclaimed humanity for themselves, ultimately. But Abahlali, of course, does not go there. We are quite that there is a bit of a tension. We won't claim recognition, but ultimately you want those people to change. You want the state to change. So there's a recognition of those people. So I don't know whether it's possible to engage in a reclamation of humanity by totally disregarding the so-called superior, so-called oppressor group. I don't know if it's possible. But yes, there is that tension, delinking, reclaiming humanity for yourself, and then the other side can come later on if they want to. Right? They can come, but it is based in a bottom-up creation of communities. The last that I would say is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa was based on this idea of healing. You are victims of apartheid, you need to heal. But what Steve Biko did and what these people are doing is to say healing can only be communal. Remember Ben Hook's term, healing is always a communal act. And that it comes from bottom up through the creation of communities based on Ubuntu. I'm tired, I don't know what I'm saying.
I think this was a very nice last word. Unless there are any urgent questions, I would kindly ask you that we take the debate further after this talk into the informal spaces. Thank you so much for this really, really wonderful talk, and thank you for your attention and your questions.